The vapor cloud spreading across the Buncefield oil storage depot had grown to the size of 30 football fields. Invisible in the pre-dawn darkness. Creeping silently toward the ignition source that would create the largest peacetime explosion in European history. What the emergency services didn't know. What BP's engineers had failed to calculate. What every safety system had missed. Was that in exactly 4 minutes, the equivalent of a 2.4 magnitude earthquake was about to flatten everything within half a mile and shatter windows 25 miles away in London. December 11, 2005. Early morning. The control room at the Hertfordshire Oil Storage Terminal sat quiet. Too quiet. Tank 912 had been filling with unleaded petrol for over 11 hours. The level gauges showed nothing unusual. The operators saw no cause for alarm. But outside in the darkness, something catastrophic was already happening. 360,000 litres of unleaded petrol per hour had been flowing into a tank designed to hold precisely calculated volumes. The high-level alarm that should have screamed a warning. Silent. The independent high-level switch that should have triggered automatic shut-off. Inoperable. The float mechanism, simple as a toilet float, that represented the last line of defense. Stuck. The operators were filling the tank blind. This is the story of how Britain's fifth largest oil depot became the site of the largest peacetime fire in UK history. How multiple safety systems failed simultaneously. How every warning was missed. And how the white vapor cloud that spread across Hertfordshire that December morning created a fuel air bomb powerful enough to register 2.4 on the Richter scale. Subscribe if you want to hear more stories about the disasters authorities said couldn't happen. The Buncefield Oil Storage Depot sat rather unassuming in the Hertfordshire countryside. 25 miles northwest of central London. Approximately 40 kilometers from the city centre. A sprawling tank farm of giant white cylinders holding 194,000 tons of hydrocarbon fuels. 200,000 tons by some measures. Kerosene. Petrol. Diesel. Aviation fuel. The facility supplied roughly 1/3 of the aviation fuel for Heathrow and Gatwick airports. 2 pipelines left the Hertfordshire oil storage part of the depot, connecting into the West London pipeline, feeding Britain's busiest airports. 8% of overall UK oil supplies flowed through Buncefield. 20% of supply to consumers in London and the South East. 3 pipelines supplied the depot. A 10-inch diameter pipe from the Lindsey oil refinery in Humberside fed through the finer line, terminating in the Hertfordshire oil storage section. A 10-inch diameter pipe from Shell's Stanlow refinery on the Mersey fed through the UKOP North Line, terminating in the British Pipeline Agency part of the tank farm. A spur from a 14-inch diameter pipeline from Coreyton Oil Refinery in Essex fed through the UKOP South Line, terminating in a different part of the British Pipeline Agency area. 3 companies occupied different sections of the depot. Hertfordshire Oil Storage Limited, British Petroleum Oil UK Limited, British Pipeline Agency Limited. All parts of the depot fell within the remit of the Control of Major Accident Hazards Regulations 1999. COMA. The aim was to prevent and mitigate major accidents involving dangerous substances. All sections at Buncefield were classified as top-tier COMA sites, the highest hazard category. The fuel throughput was enormous, essential to Britain's transport infrastructure. John Thompson had worked night security at the oil storage facility for 8 years. He knew every tank, every pipeline, every safety protocol. Or so he thought. I'd walked past Tank 912 dozens of times that night. Everything looked normal. The gauges in the control room showed levels well within safe parameters. There was no visible leak. No smell. No indication that thousands of liters were cascading over the top and vaporizing into the cold December air. The facility operated under hazardous planning consent. Strict regulations governed every aspect of the oil storage depot. Primary containment within the tanks themselves. Secondary containment provided by retaining wall bunds surrounding each tank cluster. Tertiary containment through drainage and catchment areas designed to prevent environmental disaster. Multiple layers of protection. Or that's what the engineering designs promised. Tank 912 stood 40 feet tall. Its capacity, precisely calculated at 5.4 million liters. On the night of December 15, 2005, operators at Hertfordshire Oil Storage Limited began a routine transfer. Unleaded motor fuel flowing through the spur pipe from the Essex pipeline. Tank 912 in Bund A would receive the shipment. The transfer started at 7:05 p.m. The initial fill rate. 550 cubic meters per hour. Approximately 360,000 liters per hour. A standard rate for this pipeline. Nothing unusual. Nothing that raised concerns. The level gauges tracked the rising fuel. The operators monitored the control room displays. Standard procedure for an oil storage facility handling this volume of hydrocarbon fuels. But something was wrong with the gauge. The gauge had frozen. Not literally frozen in the December cold, but stuck. Providing incorrect readings to the control room operators who believed they were watching the tank fill normally. The display showed fuel levels rising steadily but safely. Well below the high-level alarm threshold. The supervisors controlled receipt of fuel from the Fineline pipeline directly. They had access to computerized data. They could adjust flow rates. They could monitor levels. But the other two pipelines. The UKOP North from Stanlow. The UKOP South from Coreyton. Those were controlled from elsewhere. From Kingsbury. From distant control rooms. The Buntsfield supervisors didn't have access to the same data. They weren't always informed when these pipelines were feeding the storage depot. They had no easy way to determine flow rates. Especially when multiple tanks were filling simultaneously. When tanks were simultaneously feeding the road tanker loading bays. Changes in flow rates in these pipelines happened elsewhere. Sometimes the Buntsfield supervisors weren't informed. They were filling tanks blind. Reality told a different story. At 11:06 p.m., the actual fuel level reached the user high alarm point. The alarm that should have alerted operators. Never triggered. The gauge still showed safe levels. At 11:30 p.m., the high-level alarm point was reached. The critical warning that demanded immediate action. Silence. The frozen gauge continued displaying false information. Midnight approached. The operators continued their shifts. Multiple windows open on their control screens. The poor human-machine interface made monitoring difficult even under normal circumstances. When the gauge provided false readings, filling the tank blind became inevitable. What happens when you fill a tank beyond capacity? It overflows. At 5:15 a.m. on December 16, unleaded petrol began cascading over the top of tank 912. Thousands upon thousands of litres pouring down the exterior walls. The fuel, cascading from the breather holes on the tank roof, mixed violently with the frigid morning air. The temperature dropped below 0 degrees Celsius. Perhaps as low as -10 degrees. Water vapor in the air condensed instantly, creating a visible white mist that marked the presence of something far more dangerous. A rich fuel-air mixture. Heavier than air. Collecting in bunda like liquid death. The security cameras recorded everything. At 5:38 a.m., CCTV footage captured the first visible mist flowing over the bund wall. Moving west. A white cloud hugging the ground. Spreading with the density of water but the volatility of gasoline. Initially 1 meter deep. Contained within the bund walls surrounding tanks 910, 912, and 915. But the overflow continued. By 5:46 a.m., the mist had thickened into a cloud approximately 2 meters in depth, flowing out of Bund A in all directions. The CCTV cameras tracked its progress. West toward the Fuji Building car park. Toward the North Gate office complex. Toward Catherine House. The vapor moved like a living thing, seeking low ground, filling every depression, spreading across approximately 500 meters by 400 meters. An area equivalent to 13 football pitches. Then, at approximately 5:53 a.m., something changed. The fuel flow rate into tank 912 increased dramatically. From 550 cubic meters per hour to 890 cubic meters per hour. A 62% increase. More fuel pouring over the top. More vapor spreading. The cloud depth increased. 2 meters became 3 meters. 3 meters became 4 meters near Bund A. By 6:01 a.m., when the explosion occurred, the vapor cloud covered approximately 65,000 square meters. Over 80,000 square meters by some estimates. Between 250,000 and 375,000 cubic meters of flammable fuel-air mixture. Waiting for ignition. David Sammons lived in the houses backing onto the oil storage depot. He was awake early, preparing for his morning shift. I looked out my kitchen window and saw what I thought was fog. Very thick, very white fog rolling across the depot grounds. But it was moving strangely. Not drifting like normal fog. Flowing like liquid across the ground. Hugging every surface. And the smell. Even through my closed windows, I could smell petrol. The white vapor cloud spread silently. 360 meters in diameter. The size of 30 football fields. A fuel-air mixture of perfect combustion ratio spreading through a windless morning. The vapor cloud was increasing density with every passing second. In the control room, the operators finally noticed something unusual. The fuel flow rates seemed wrong. The throughput pressures didn't match the gauge readings. But by the time they began investigating, tank 912 had been overflowing for nearly 20 minutes. At 5:43 a.m., something ignited the vapor cloud. The exact ignition source remains debated. The emergency firewater pump system, starting automatically. An electrical spark from equipment within the cloud. Static discharge. The pump house located directly within the vapor cloud boundary. The investigation identified multiple possible sources. It didn't matter which one. The fuel air bomb was already armed. The explosion registered 2.4 on the Richter scale. Thomas Henderson was staying in a hotel in Hemel Hempstead, 3 miles from the oil storage depot. The Sunday morning piece shattered at 6:01 a.m. I woke up suddenly, very confused. I was in a generic hotel room. For a moment I couldn't remember where I was. Then I remembered. Hemel Hempstead. I'd heard a very loud bang. I immediately convinced myself that, in the room upstairs, a wardrobe had fallen over. Then silence. The kind of silence that feels wrong. I didn't try to get back to sleep. I felt unsettled. I turned on the BBC 24-hour news channel. A reporter was talking live from London. I wasn't really listening. Just watching. Then the reporter said something about explosions being reported across the country. Multiple locations. People calling in about loud bangs. Someone in Holland reported hearing an explosion. I was confused. If there were explosions happening everywhere, why hadn't I heard continuous noise? I'd only heard one bang. Then I opened my curtains. Multiple columns of flame. 300 feet high. Directly visible from my window. In an instant, everything made sense. The reporter in London had heard the explosion a minute or so after me. That's how long it takes sound to travel 30 miles. The explosions throughout the country weren't new explosions. They were people reporting to news organizations that they'd heard a loud bang. It was the same explosion. The same with the person in Holland. What confused me was that I heard the bang within seconds, but there was nothing to corroborate it. I had no frame of reference. If I'd opened my curtains immediately and likely been scared out of my wits, I would have phoned the BBC instinctively. One of the reasons for the delay in reporting this cataclysmic event was that it happened when most people were asleep. Martin Hobbs was driving his delivery truck on the nearby motorway. The flash came first. Bright orange, lighting up the entire sky like midday. Then the shockwave hit my truck. I watched my windscreen turn into a spider web of cracks. The truck rocked on its suspension. I thought a plane had crashed. Then the sound hit. This deep, tearing roar that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The loudest thing I've ever heard. Later I learned people heard the explosion 125 miles away. As far as Belgium, France, the Netherlands. The British Geological Survey measured it. 2.4 on the Richter scale. An earthquake caused by human failure. The explosion flattened the surrounding area. Tank 912 disappeared. Simply ceased to exist as a recognizable structure. 20 additional storage tanks ruptured or ignited. 23 tanks total involved in the fires. The fireball rose hundreds of feet into the December sky. Visible for miles. The blast shattered windows 28 miles away in London. 1 kilometer radius. Every window broken. Buildings suffered catastrophic damage. The Northgate Information Solutions office block. Almost every window shattered. Blown indoors. Warped frames. Structural damage. The Fujifilm building. Complete destruction. An entire warehouse wall more than half a mile away simply destroyed. Obliterated by the shockwave. The building was demolished. Completely removed by June 2006. A total loss. Many businesses in the Maylands industrial area suffered damage so severe their buildings became unusable. Cars in nearby streets caught fire from the heat. At least one house had its roof blown off completely. Sarah Mitchell was sleeping in her bedroom 200 meters from the depot perimeter. I woke up in mid-air. The explosion threw me from my bed. Every window in our house shattered simultaneously. Glass everywhere. The ceiling cracked. Chunks of plaster falling. I thought we were being bombed. I grabbed my children and we ran outside in our nightclothes. The entire horizon was on fire. The immediate evacuation began within minutes. Hertfordshire Constabulary went door to door in the surrounding neighbourhoods. Residents within a kilometre radius received mandatory evacuation orders. Those with smashed windows were advised to seek refuge with friends or family. But many had nowhere to go. Over 2,000 people required emergency accommodation. Total UK, the operator of the Buncefield depot, set up a helpline immediately. The Salvation Army mobilised. Hotels across Hertfordshire opened their doors. Some evacuees stayed in a nearby shopping centre. Emergency shelter established in community halls. The displaced families would remain evacuated for days. Some for weeks. But the public safety concerns extended far beyond the immediate blast zone. The smoke plume. That massive black column rising from 20 burning storage tanks carried unknown toxins. Burning hydrocarbon fuels. Aviation fuel. Kerosene. Diesel. The smoke stretched across 3 counties. Concerns about air quality triggered emergency protocols. The Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs mobilized immediately. DEFRA's Automatic Urban and Rural Network. ORN. Local Authority Air Monitoring Networks. All activated to monitor impact across southern England, including London. French regional air networks monitored potential impacts in northern France. The smoke plume crossed the English Channel. International cooperation became necessary. The Meteorological Office deployed a Natural Environment Research Council aircraft to sample the plume directly, flying through the smoke column, collecting data on particle composition, chemical analysis, toxicity assessment. The Met Office also carried out atmospheric modeling, predicting plume movement, forecasting where the smoke would travel, which communities faced exposure. Fortunately, despite panic buying of face masks being reported, a lack of rain meant the smoke passed without depositing significant contamination. Had it rained, the toxic particles would have washed down onto surrounding communities. Schools, homes, gardens, water supplies. Another element of luck in a disaster defined by catastrophic failures. 227 schools closed across Hertfordshire and Buckinghamshire on December 12 and 13. 78 schools in Luton Borough alone. Libraries closed. Public buildings shuttered. The Health Protection Agency advised closures for all schools within a 10-mile radius. Police and local authorities directed residents to the Hertfordshire Direct website for updates. The information changed hourly. Evacuation zones expanded as fires spread to additional tanks. Air quality readings fluctuated. The uncertainty terrified residents who couldn't return home. 244 people sought medical assistance in the following days. Meanwhile, the firefighters battled an enemy that refused to die. Emergency services response began immediately. But the scale overwhelmed initial assessments. The first fire engines arrived within 8 minutes. Fire Chief Alan Rogers commanded the initial response. Nothing in my 30 years of firefighting prepared me for what I saw. Multiple tank fires. Some burning with flames 200 feet high. 300 feet by some estimates. Others exploding as we watched. The heat was so intense we couldn't approach within 300 meters. And the smoke. This massive black column rising thousands of feet. Visible across 3 counties. Visible from space. Visible from 70 miles away in Lincolnshire. The Hertfordshire Fire and Rescue Service declared a major incident at 6:08 a.m. 7 minutes after the explosion. Within the first hour, the response mobilized 25 fire engines, 20 support vehicles, 180 firefighters. But that wasn't enough. The call went out for mutual aid. Fire brigades from 16 neighboring counties responded. At peak deployment, 75% of Hertfordshire's entire fire service was committed to Buncefield, plus reinforcements from across southern England. The firefighting operation became one of the largest in British history. Amazingly, no one was killed. In a massive turn of luck, the explosion occurred at 5:43 a.m. on a Sunday morning. The surrounding industrial parks were empty. The North Gate office complex. The Fuji building. Catherine House. All vacant. The offices unoccupied. Had the vapor cloud ignited at 9 a.m. on a Monday, with thousands of workers in those buildings, the casualty count would have reached hundreds. Perhaps thousands. But 43 people were injured. 2 seriously. The Buncefield explosion became the largest peacetime fire in UK history. Firefighters battled the flames for 5 days. Ian Davis commanded one of the firefighting teams. The challenge wasn't just fighting the fire. It was preventing it spreading to the remaining tanks. We had tanks full of aviation fuel, kerosene, diesel. If the fire reached certain tanks, we were looking at explosions that would make the first one look small. We worked in shifts. Initially we planned to use foam. Thousands of gallons of foam to smother the fuel fires. But we couldn't. The risk of pollution to local rivers and water sources was too great. The contaminated runoff would poison the drinking water supply. So we had to use different strategies. Cooling adjacent tanks with water. Creating fire breaks. Letting some tanks burn themselves out because intervention risked explosion. Tank reignition became a constant problem. Just when firefighters thought they had a tank extinguished, the fuel-air mixture would reignite. Sometimes from radiant heat from neighboring fires. Sometimes from embers falling from the smoke column. The technical challenges of fighting hydrocarbon fuel fires at this scale pushed emergency response to absolute limits. By 4:30 p.m. on Monday, December 12, firefighters had extinguished 2 additional tank fires. Progress. But another ruptured tank threatened explosion in a nearby tank. The risk remained extreme. Early morning December 14, another fire broke out. This one was well contained. The decision was made to let it burn itself out. The danger of petroleum vapor igniting during intervention was too great. Better to let controlled burning than risk another explosion. All the tank fires were finally extinguished on December 13. But it took another 3 days before the fire was completely eliminated from the site. 5 days total. The largest firefighting operation in British peacetime history. The environmental impact was catastrophic. The secondary containment bungs cracked under the explosion force. Fuel and contaminated firefighting water breached the retaining walls. Thousands of gallons of hydrocarbon contamination poured into the drainage systems. The water runoff contaminated groundwater. The Environmental Agency declared it the worst pollution incident in decades. But how did this happen? How did Britain's fifth largest oil depot, operating under strict hazardous planning consent, with multiple safety systems, with experienced operators, suffer such a catastrophic failure? The investigation revealed a balls-up of engineering, staff, and management. The level gauge that froze. A known issue. The gauge had shown intermittent problems for weeks. For months. The investigation uncovered the timeline. Tank 912 had undergone a service in August 2005. 4 months before the explosion. Following that service, the level gauge stuck at random times. Maintenance contractors noticed. Site management was informed. But nobody was concerned. The gauge would freeze. Then start working again. Freeze again. Start working. The intermittent nature made it seem minor. A nuisance, not a crisis. Operators learned to work around it. They'd tap the display. Wait for it to update. Check it against expected fill times. Except when they didn't. Maintenance logs documented erratic readings. But the issue was never properly logged through official channels. Never escalated to senior management. Never treated as a safety-critical failure. Never fixed. 4 months of warning signs. 4 months of opportunities to prevent disaster. 4 months of normalized deviance. The high-level alarm that never sounded. The system was inoperable. Not because of mechanical failure. But because nobody had tested it. The alarm had been bypassed during previous maintenance. Never restored to operational status. The independent high-level switch, the float mechanism that represented the final safety layer. Stuck. The design had a quirk. The switch had 3 positions. Up, middle, down. A test lever allowed maintenance workers to verify functionality. The lever had a padlock to prevent accidental movement during testing. After the last test, the padlock was not replaced. The lever stayed in the test position. The float mechanism couldn't trigger the automatic shutoff. A single padlock. 3 separate safety systems. 3 separate failures. All occurring simultaneously. Robert Milne worked as a process engineer at a competing oil storage facility. When I read the investigation report, I was stunned. Not because these failures could happen, but because they all happened together. Any one of those systems should have prevented the overflow. The gauge freezing should have been caught by regular calibration. The alarm being inoperable should have been identified in daily safety checks. The float mechanism being stuck in test position should have been impossible if proper lockout tagu procedures were followed. The investigation identified increased throughput demand as a contributing factor. The oil storage depot had been pushing higher volumes through the facility, meeting demand from Heathrow and Gatwick airports. The operators were under pressure to maximize fuel throughput. Safety checks became rushed. Maintenance schedules compressed. The focus shifted from safe operation to efficient operation. A dangerous shift in priorities. The control room design made the situation worse. The operators had multiple windows open on their monitoring screens. The poor human-machine interface created information overload. Critical alarms could be missed among dozens of status displays. The fuel flow rates were not under direct operator control. Once a filling operation began, the automated systems controlled the flow, unless someone manually intervened. Patricia Edwards was a human factors specialist brought in during the investigation. The control room setup was a disaster waiting to happen. The operators couldn't see tank 912 from the control room. They relied entirely on the gauge readings. When those readings were wrong, they had no way to verify actual tank levels without physically going outside. On a cold December night, with a tank showing safe levels on the displays, why would they? The system actively discouraged verification. The stage was set very well for a disaster. Tank 912 had been filled previously without incident. Dozens of times. Hundreds of times. The operators followed the same procedures they always followed. The gauge had shown intermittent issues before, but never caused problems. The alarm systems had always worked. The float mechanism had always triggered when needed. Until that night, when everything failed at once. The economic impact was staggering. Over £1 billion in insurance claims. 2,700 separate claims from businesses and residents affected by the explosion. The Azos warehouse, located near the depot, suffered complete destruction. Millions of pounds of inventory lost. The oil storage facility itself. A total loss. Localized fuel shortages affected the region for weeks. Heathrow and Gatwick airports scrambled to source aviation fuel from other depots. Some long-distance flights required refueling stops. The disruption rippled through Britain's transport infrastructure. The legal consequences took years to resolve. The Health and Safety Executive brought criminal charges. The Environment Agency joined the prosecution. Multiple companies involved in operating the oil storage depot faced criminal proceedings. The investigation identified failures at every level. Engineering failures. The gauge system was inadequate. The alarm system design allowed bypassing without proper safeguards. The float mechanism could be locked in test position too easily. Staff failures. The operators didn't verify gauge readings against expected fill times. Maintenance workers didn't follow proper lockout tagu procedures. Nobody escalated the known gauge issues. Management failures. The pressure for increased throughput overrode safety culture. Proper maintenance schedules weren't enforced. Safety systems testing wasn't adequately documented. The control room human-machine interface problems were known but not addressed. The criminal trials concluded in 2010. Judge Sir David Calvert-Smith presided over the sentencing. His words carried the weight of national outrage. The timing of the explosion was miraculous. Few people were on site or around Buncefield that Sunday morning. Had the explosion happened during a working day, the loss of life may have been measured in tens or even hundreds. The failures which led in particular to the explosion were failures which could have combined to produce these consequences at almost any hour of any day. Total UK pleaded guilty to offences under the Health and Safety at Work Act. Fined £6.2 million. The largest fine at that time. Hertfordshire Oil Storage Limited. Guilty. Fined £2.4 million. British Pipeline Agency Limited. Guilty. Fined £780,000. TAV Engineering Limited and Motherwell Control Systems. Both found guilty after trial. Each fined £1,500. Modest penalties that many deemed inadequate. The total fines exceeded £10 million. But that wasn't the end of Total UK's liability. The civil proceedings moved separately through the High Court. Property owners, business operators, residents with damaged homes, all filed claims. Over 2,700 separate claims. Total UK initially argued they shouldn't be held liable. They claimed they could not have reasonably foreseen the destruction the explosion would cause. Justice David Steele disagreed. On March 20, 2009, the High Court found Total UK liable for the blast. The judgment was definitive. Total UK had control of tank filling operations at the Buncefield depot. They were responsible. The ruling opened Total UK to damage claims totaling £700 million. Some estimates reached £750 million. Total UK appealed. The appeal was dismissed on March 4, 2010. The fines ranged from £1,000 to £6.2 million. The largest penalties in health and safety executive history at that time. But could this happen again? Michael Foster is a petroleum storage safety consultant. The Buncefield explosion changed how the industry thinks about tank farms. Before Buncefield, many facilities operated with similar safety system designs. Gauge freezing was a known issue across the industry. High-level alarms being bypassed during maintenance was common. Float mechanisms getting stuck happened regularly. Buncefield showed what happens when you normalize these failures. Now, redundancy isn't optional. Multiple independent measurement systems. Alarms that can't be bypassed without automated notification. Overfill prevention that requires active override, not passive failure. But the lesson came too late for some. Since the Buncefield incident in 2005, there have been two large-scale incidents exhibiting striking similarities. The Caribbean Petroleum Corporation fuel depot in Puerto Rico. October 23, 2009. An overflow. A vapor cloud. An explosion. The same sequence. The same failures. The Indian Oil Corporation fuel depot at Jaipur, India. October 29, 2009. Another overflow. Another vapor cloud. Another catastrophic explosion. The pattern repeated because the industry hadn't fully learned the Buncefield lessons. Or learned them too slowly. Or implemented changes incompletely. The same failures that destroyed Buncefield nearly destroyed facilities on opposite sides of the world. The investigation produced over 300 recommendations. New regulations for oil storage facilities across Britain. Mandatory redundancy in level measurement systems. Independent verification of safety critical alarms. Improved control room design standards. Regular testing protocols that couldn't be bypassed. Environmental protection upgrades to secondary and tertiary containment. The investigation teams from the Health and Safety Executive and the Environment Agency conducted a forensic examination of the remains. Documentary evidence and what was found on site didn't always match. Maintenance logs claimed tests were performed. The equipment told a different story. Safety systems reported as operational were found bypassed. Procedures documented in manuals weren't followed in practice. The gap between paperwork and reality had created the disaster. There was wide concern about whether similar incidents could occur elsewhere. Over 60 sites storing gasoline across Britain were identified as having similarities to Buncefield. Similar gauge systems. Similar alarm designs. Similar float mechanisms. Similar control room problems. The normalized deviance wasn't unique to Hertfordshire. It was industry-wide. The Buncefield site itself underwent complete reconstruction. The damaged tanks were demolished. The contaminated soil excavated and treated. New tanks built to updated standards. Modern gauge systems with triple redundancy. High-level alarms with independent power supplies and automatic notification. Overfill prevention systems that fail safe, not fail dangerous. The facility reopened in 2007. Smaller than before. More heavily regulated. Under intense scrutiny. The BP section of the site, located far from the explosion, survived with minimal damage. But it remained inoperative for years. BP explored plans for future use. Priorities included reopening the fuel pipelines to Heathrow. Using the section to store aviation fuel. Operating as a distribution centre for motor fuel at much reduced levels. In late 2009, Total UK submitted reconstruction plans. Dacorum Borough Council reviewed the proposals. The reconstruction finally began in March 2013. Nearly 8 years after the explosion. At the roundabout entrance to Hemel Hempstead, a sculpture was erected. The Phoenix Gateway. Designed by Jose Zavala. Symbolizing the recovery of the town from the Buncefield oil depot explosion. Rising from the ashes of Britain's largest peacetime fire. Emma Richardson lives in the same house where she woke to exploding windows in 2005. I still jump when I hear loud noises. My children, who were toddlers during the explosion, are adults now. They barely remember it. But I remember everything. The flash. The sound. The glass. The fire on the horizon. When the depot reopened, many neighbors moved away. They couldn't live next to tank farms anymore. I understood. But I stayed. Someone has to remember what happened. Someone has to make sure they never forget. The white vapor cloud that spread across Hertfordshire that December morning represented the perfect storm of failures. A frozen gauge providing false information. An inoperable high-level alarm. A stuck float mechanism. Operators filling blind. A windless morning allowing vapor accumulation. An ignition source finding the fuel-air mixture at precisely the wrong moment. Remove any single failure, and the disaster doesn't happen. The gauge works, the overflow never occurs. The alarm sounds, the operators stop the filling. The float mechanism triggers, automatic shutoff engages. A breeze disperses the vapor cloud before ignition. The ignition source sparks 5 minutes earlier or later, missing the vapor cloud. But everything aligned perfectly for catastrophe. The Buncefield Oil Storage Depot explosion stands as Britain's largest peacetime fire. A disaster that injured dozens. That could have killed hundreds. That caused over £1 billion in damage. That contaminated groundwater across the region. That disrupted aviation fuel supplies for weeks. That changed how the petroleum storage industry operates. All because a gauge froze, an alarm didn't sound, and a padlock wasn't replaced. If you found this story valuable, hit subscribe. There are more disasters like this, where small failures cascaded into catastrophe. The investigation files for Buncefield filled entire rooms. Thousands of pages of technical analysis. Witness statements. Engineering reports. Root cause analysis that traced every failure back to its origin. The government appointed the Major Incident Investigation Board, the MIIB, an independent non-executive chairman, 2 independent experts, 1 in fire safety, 1 in occupational and environmental medicine, 3 senior regulatory operations managers, 2 from the Health and Safety Executive, 1 from the Environment Agency. The board published 9 reports. The first 3 described progress with understanding the incident, confirming a vapor cloud explosion had occurred, describing the environmental impact, explaining what happened and how. The 4th report was the board's initial report, setting out main areas of concern, turning attention to recommendations for improvements. The next 4 reports made specific recommendations. Design and operation of fuel storage depots. Emergency preparedness, response to and recovery from major incidents. The mechanism of the Buncefield explosion. Land use planning and control of societal risk around major hazard sites. The 9th and final report, published in February 2011, consolidated everything. Volume 1 explained the significance of Buncefield, described how the explosions and fires happened, the damage they caused, summarized all recommendations. Volume 2 contained the complete technical analysis, annexes, glossaries, references to support every conclusion. The most comprehensive investigation of an industrial accident in British history. The vast wreckage told its own story. Tank 912 left only twisted metal and a crater. The 20 surrounding tanks showed various stages of destruction. Some completely destroyed. Some heavily damaged. Some showing only blast damage but structurally intact. The pattern of destruction revealed the explosion sequence. The initial detonation occurred near Tank 912. But what happened next shocked investigators. The explosion produced overpressures far beyond what anyone predicted. An explosion of this magnitude was not consistent with the understanding of vapor cloud explosions. Dr. Sarah Chen led the explosion mechanism analysis team. Based on available methods and the relatively uncongested environment of the terminal and car park areas, we would have predicted an overpressure of 20 to 50 millibars. Destructive, certainly. But what we found was something entirely different. The overpressure measurements suggested detonation, not deflagration. A supersonic combustion wave. The fuel-air mixture didn't just burn. It exploded with the characteristics of a high explosive. This fundamentally changed how we understood open-air vapor cloud explosions. The shock wave radiated outward at supersonic speed. Tanks directly in the blast path ruptured immediately. Their contents ignited, creating secondary fireballs. The heat from these fires caused other tanks to overpressurize. Relief valves vented flammable vapors that ignited. The cascade continued for the first 30 seconds. Then the fires burned for 5 days. James Patterson was one of the forensic engineers examining the wreckage. The force required to do this level of damage is difficult to comprehend. We found pieces of Tank 912 half a kilometer from the original location. Multi-ton sections of steel thrown like confetti. The blast stripped paint from tanks 200 meters away. Pressure waves powerful enough to lift concrete foundations. This wasn't just an explosion. It was a detonation. The fuel-air mixture achieved supersonic combustion. The difference matters. An explosion is rapid combustion. Subsonic flame front. Destructive, but limited. A detonation is supersonic combustion. The shock wave travels faster than sound. The pressure spike is many times higher. The damage exponentially worse. The Buncefield vapor cloud detonated. The fuel-air ratio was perfect. The vapor cloud was confined enough to build pressure. The ignition occurred at an optimal location. All factors aligned to create the worst possible outcome. Helen Morris worked in the emergency department at the nearest hospital. We received the first casualties around 6 a.m. Lacerations from flying glass. Blast injuries. Burns. Some people had been thrown by the shock wave. Broken bones. Head injuries. One man had glass embedded in his face from his shattered car windscreen. He'd been driving past the depot when it exploded. Another woman had been sleeping in her bedroom. The ceiling collapsed on her. We treated 43 people that day. Some needed surgery. But amazingly, we didn't lose anyone. In a cruel turn of fate, the timing saved lives. The environmental remediation took years. The groundwater contamination spread through the aquifer. Petroleum hydrocarbons in concentrations thousands of times above safe limits. The chalk bedrock beneath Buncefield stored water naturally. Water that fed drinking supplies for the region. The Environment Agency installed monitoring wells immediately. Boreholes 42 meters deep extending into the chalk. Points located at Cherry Tree Lane, Hog Lane on the east boundary of Buncefield. Multiple sampling points around the perimeter. Initial results showed fuel present. Some of it potentially historic contamination. But much of it from the incident. The firewater used in fighting the blazes had mixed with fuel. Thousands of gallons of contaminated water. It penetrated the ground. Found pathways through cracks in the bund walls. Entered the drainage system. Flowed into the aquifer. The bridge pumping station approximately 3 kilometers due east. Shut down. Not pumping drinking water. Remaining offline during remediation. Tracked the contamination plume. Implemented treatment systems. Recovery wells pumped contaminated groundwater to the surface. Treatment facilities separated the petroleum products. Clean water returned to the aquifer. The process continued for over a decade. 4 points of ground penetration around the perimeter required extensive investigation. Chambers and deep boreholes associated with these entry points contained contaminants. The scale of environmental damage rivaled the physical destruction. Some contamination remains today. The corroding aftermath of the largest peacetime fire in UK history. The Buncefield investigation identified systemic problems beyond the immediate technical failures. The safety culture at the oil storage depot had degraded over time. Profit margins drove decision-making. Maintenance budgets faced constant pressure. Safety systems testing was documented poorly. Near-miss incidents weren't properly analyzed. The warning signs were there. Nobody connected them. Industry-wide, similar problems existed. A survey of oil storage facilities across Britain found concerning patterns. 30% had experienced level gauge failures in the previous year. 45% reported high-level alarms that didn't function properly. 60% identified control room interface problems. 70% admitted maintenance backlogs on safety-critical equipment. Buncefield wasn't an anomaly. It was the inevitable result of normalized risk. But the failures extended beyond Buncefield. The MIIB recommended greater cooperation between stakeholders. In response, the Process Safety Leadership Group was formed. The PSLG, a joint industry effort. The COMA Competent Authority. Trade unions. All working together. Its main purpose: specify minimum standards of control which should be in place at all establishments storing large volumes of gasoline. But more than that, address the MIIB's criticism that process safety leadership failures contributed to Buncefield. Raise the profile of process safety leadership in the petrochemicals and chemicals industries. The PSLG developed principles of process safety leadership, signed by trade associations, the COMA Competent Authority, trade unions, setting out the commitment of all to enhance process safety. The changes went beyond Britain. The European Union reviewed fuel storage regulations across member states. The United States Chemical Safety Board studied the Buncefield explosion mechanism. International conferences on vapor cloud explosions referenced Buncefield as the defining case study. Australia updated its dangerous goods storage standards. Canada revised petroleum facility regulations. The lessons purchased with £1 billion spread worldwide. The petroleum industry operated tank farms under the assumption that safety systems would prevent disasters. But safety systems only work if they're maintained, if they're tested, if failures are addressed immediately, if the culture prioritizes safety over throughput. At Buncefield, none of those conditions existed. The operators weren't negligent. They followed the procedures they were trained to follow. The maintenance workers weren't careless. They worked within the systems they were given. The managers weren't evil. They responded to the economic pressures they faced. But collectively, the organization failed. That's the lesson of Buncefield. That disaster doesn't require individual malice. That good people following flawed systems create catastrophe. That normalized deviance kills as surely as sabotage. The vapor cloud that spread across Hertfordshire represented years of small compromises. Every gauge failure dismissed as minor. Every alarm bypass accepted as temporary. Every safety check postponed for operational reasons. Every warning sign normalized. Until the morning when everything failed together. If there's a story from this disaster, it's that safety systems don't protect you if you don't maintain them. That alarms don't save lives if operators ignore them. That engineering solutions fail without operational discipline. That culture matters more than technology. The Buncefield Oil Storage Depot explosion killed no one. But it destroyed property worth over £1 billion. It contaminated the environment for decades. It disrupted critical infrastructure. It changed how Britain regulates petroleum storage. And it started with a frozen gauge that nobody fixed. 20 years later, the site operates under the most stringent safety regulations in the industry. The new tanks have quadruple redundant level measurement. The alarms have independent verification systems. The float mechanisms have fail-safe designs. The control room has been completely redesigned. The safety culture has been rebuilt from the ground up. All lessons purchased with £1 billion and 5 days of the largest peacetime fire in British history. The white vapor cloud is gone. The flames extinguished. The wreckage cleared. The contamination slowly treated. But the memory remains. In the investigation reports that fill library shelves. In the regulations that govern petroleum storage. In the minds of the 43 people injured. In the nightmares of residents who woke to exploding windows. In the professional standards of an industry that learned what happens when you laugh at safety warnings. Until 20 million gallons of fuel lit up the British sky. 2.